Law has been changing people's lives for almost 60 years. He is one of the most powerful living examples of the sheer power of a positive approach to our challenges. Alvin was born without arms, and when he was 5 days old, became homeless after his birth family chose not to keep him. As Alvin often states, it was the best thing that could have ever happened. Alvin was soon adopted by a couple who changed his story from tragedy to triumph. They not only taught him to use his feet for hands, but also created a culture of belief in the impossible that Alvin lives and speaks about every day. Alvin is now a Canadian Hall of Fame professional speaker, and in 2018 was inducted into Canada's Disability Hall of Fame.
How would you describe yourself? I bring this up because people that are different describe themselves differently, especially on the interweb. So I thought this was a great question to start out with.
So that's a great question to start out with, Alexandra. And I'm gonna be a little bit cheeky, to use a British word. My father was from England, and I'm gonna say different than what? Because I think that's where a lot of this comes right down to a very important discussion. I'll give you my favorite pet peeve right now with COVID, and that is the new normal. And by the way, I'm not fussy, or I'm not one to be stubborn or try to challenge things just for my ego. I do it to be provocative, to make people think. So when they say the new normal, my answer to that is compared to what? So I think that's part of the problem is we deal more with the disability issue no matter what it is. And I find it completely fascinating that you would have what I would call a hidden handicap. And just to start off right off the very top, one of my favorite examples is my wife is quite deaf. She wasn't deaf when I met her. She became deaf over years because of a genetic problem that she has in her family. So she has powerful hearing aids, but she has a real struggle being able to talk, especially now with masks. So if her and I were standing on a street corner together because her physical abilities are not touched, who's the handicapped one? And of course, people would say, well, the dude without arms is the handicapped one. Right, except wrong. There's nothing handicapped about me. There's nothing handicapped about my wife. There's nothing handicapped about you. The problem is we have challenges. That is accurate. And our challenges are unique to each of us. But what I love about your question is you could take another person without arms and they would have a totally different story. So what we have in common is not our lack of arms. What we have in common is our being human. And that's real cheesy, but that is my answer because that's what defines us. Not our differences, our similarities.
That's absolutely amazing. You really your story is amazing. I think that's a great answer. And, I wish more people would think in that manner because we're all different regardless. And, the one thing we all have in common is that we're human. Side note.
Yeah. And by the way, Alexander, sorry to interrupt. COVID has really brought that into the spotlight.
Yeah.
I don't know if people truly understand or get that this is across the entire planet, right? It almost feels like it's just in our city or in our state or in our province or in our country. It is across the globe and it is, and it's infecting people the same way in Australia, in India, in Europe, in China. God forbid we want to talk about that. And that again is its own little problem is people love to find a reason to blame, right? That's another thing that I've never done. But I also believe, and we'll cover this today as we talk, in my opinion, and being 60 years old now, I've had a lot of time to think about this. There is no doubt in my mind that when you're born with a significant challenge, it is completely different than you acquiring a significant challenge during a stage in your life, especially as you get older. You had mentioned the fact that you had a stroke when you were, a baby?
Yeah,
that is one of the most common things for people to have. Yeah. So imagine what that means to a person who's 70 years old when they've lived their entire life and all of a sudden they have a stroke. You learned the way that you would learn from birth, not to downplay what you did. But I think when we're born with something, It is not only our normal, but it is our starting point. And that overcoming stuff, I hear you. You know what I've often said, Alexander, and this is going to bend a few minds here. Whenever I hear someone say, I'm learning disabled, my answer is, no, you're not. You're teaching disabled. In other words, you think the way you think, it doesn't make it wrong, but it doesn't match the status quo for how we teach people. So that's another way to look at it.
It's amazing. I'm so excited for people to watch this. I mean, this interview with you, because wow, it's a great perspective. I really, really.
Thank you.
Yeah. I'm very impressed. So your website states that in over 30 years of professional speaking, Alvin, clearly you, has never told his story exactly the same way. Can you share why this is true? Or what's the reasoning?
Sure. So, well, the reasoning behind it, first of all, is that every audience that I speak to as a professional speaker has its own unique personality. So if I'm speaking to a group, I'll give you a perfect example. In 2018, which is going back a couple of years now, but in 2018, on 3 successive Fridays, and I love this story because one of the elements of this story involves Manhattan, all right? On 3 successive Fridays, I was the opening keynote speaker for 3 different events. On a Friday in October, I spoke to 2,600 hairdressers and estheticians at an international, it was just a huge, like a fashion show of makeup and hair in Manhattan, in New York, for 2,600 people from all over the planet. It looked like the Paris runway. It was that fancy. You may want to ask, what's a guy with no hair and no arms doing talking to hairdressers? We'll get to that. The following Friday, I was in the Bahamas speaking to the Caribbean Banking Association for their annual convention. And the following Friday, I was speaking to a group of golf teachers for a company called Golf Tech, who do digital analysis of your golf swing and teach you how to play better. What do those 3 things have in common? But the commonality was me being the speaker. So each and every one of them has a different life. Each and every one of them has a different profession. I would tell my story to them based on what I'm trying to get across to that particular group. So I would tell different stories for hairdressers. I would talk more about how I believe the irony that, albeit our exterior defines us, especially in the beauty industry, how many ugly, beautiful people have you met? Right? Yeah. So I try to encourage them to understand, to build a relationship with your clients. So not only can you make them appear to look better on the outside, but maybe you can also work on them having more pride from the inside out. The bankers, I talked about ethics and morals and having a very high standard for dealing in the banking industry. And the golfers, I essentially talked to them about how lucky does a person get to be in a world where you coach people to golf. Right? And golf is supposed to be fun. And that would be, again, my reminder to them was attitude involves every element of those 3 groups. But attitude is personal for each audience because they have a different personality. If I'm talking to high school students, if I'm talking to college age students, if I'm talking to a group of people theoretically with a disability, each and every one of those speeches is going to have its own form. But what I meant by it, I've never said the same thing twice. I didn't write a canned speech like for today. When I asked you before we started recording, how long is this going to be? I never know what I'm going to say because every interview is different. Your interview is going to be different than one I did yesterday with another person, right? Because it's the same Alvin Law, but the content is different because the person asking the questions is not the same person. Same with an audience.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. I think it's wonderful. Again, I think you're so inspirational. It's
Thank you.
Quite impressive. And this could be a topic of other conversation, but if your wife is interested too in like doing an interview, I would love to interview her. I think her story from what you've told me is amazing. Also specifically being obviously married to somebody who also has a difference. I know she wasn't deaf when you first obviously started dating or got married, but it's very interesting and it's wonderful.
But Alexander, while you bring that up, a lot of people look at my wife and go, why would you marry a guy without arms?
That's
we
awful.
hear stories of people.
I'm
No,
sorry.
but
Why
it's
would
true,
they
isn't
say
it?
that?
So
That's
many people.
ridiculous.
Yeah. So in other words, and I say it not to be disrespectful if people look at us and wonder. I don't mean it that way. What I mean is our society has become very conditioned to what we see when we watch people. And I think that's why we're getting better. You know, I use a perfect example, Alexandra. My age has taught me so many things. I come from an era, maybe you can relate to this. I'm not asking such a personal question to know about your boyfriend, but how often do we see, for example, mixed race relationships? When I was a kid, there wasn't such a thing. There wasn't. If you were white, you dated someone white. If you're black, you dated someone black. Love doesn't know skin color. And I think that's why we're so caught up in so many of these emotions. And we will get to this as we talk today, Alexandra, but love is a very strange thing. But how many people do we know? And I like to make fun of this, but not to be disrespectful. My wife was married before too. And I called them Ken and Barbie, like the dolls, right? Because my wife is very physically beautiful. She's blonde. She has a perfect figure. She's got perfect teeth. She's got perfect skin. I mean, she's one of those Barbies. And she was married to her Ken, also a perfect physical male specimen. And on top of that, he was a police officer, right? What a picture those two made together.
What was your inspiration to write Alvin's Laws of Life, 5 Steps to Overcoming Anything?
This one?
Yes.
This is it.
Yeah.
Okay, that's a great question. The inspiration was very simple. As a speaker, before I wrote the book, the most popular question after what happened to you was, where's your book? You must have a story. Right. And I actually, to be quite blunt about this, I had never any intention of writing a book. I didn't really see the point, because whenever I'd read stories of people that had stories, I thought, well, you know, Nelson Mandela, he's got a story, right? Michelle Obama, she's got a story. You know, Spike Lee, he's got a story. What's Alvin Law's story? Until everyone started saying, but Alvin, you do have a story. And it occurred to me, it's a great segue into, do you have a book, Alexandra? Right? Because we all have a book in us. But humility, which is a good thing, can keep people from thinking that they've got a book in them. So what I actually did was I started, when I met my wife, she said, you know, you should be writing these down, these stories of your life, because things happen to you that don't necessarily happen to other people because of not only your profession, but also because of what you do. So I started making notes, but then I had a very specific event that took place. I very rarely speak as a professional to the same group twice. So I'm not a coach. I'm not a trainer. I won't go into a meeting on a Monday in January and then go into the same meeting on a Thursday in April with the same group of people. Mostly because that's what I've determined for my audience. I'm a keynote speaker for conventions, more so than a worker for internal operations of a group. When I go to speak, I tell my story. Now, what we said earlier was it's never the same twice. One thing that is the same every time is the story of my birth, is the story of my being homeless, is the story of being adopted, is the story of growing up in a small town. But all of these stories, they tend to dictate one message. When I got asked to speak to a group, the same group, 4 months after I'd spoken to them, and they insisted, you got to come up with a new talk, I freaked because I never had to do that. And I didn't want to write something that was contrived or unpersonal or impersonal. So I decided to write what I called my laws. So let me just give you a graphic example here.
Yeah,
I
can
wrote
you tell us about
paragraph.
the laws?
Yeah. So they spell my name, right? And they are attitude, learning, valuing your life and spirit, imagination, and never giving up. They're like my personal mission statement. A lot of companies have them. So when I wrote this, that's what I did my seminar on that day with them. And I encouraged them, all of the participants who were a sales group, to write their own personal mission statement, like a guide. I mean, I'm not overly religious, but I like to say things like, why do we need the Bible? We know all those things. That's the way it's supposed to be. Or why do we have, any of these volumes for Jewish people or for Muslim people or for anyone who has a book? Why do we need those books? We should know those things as a common sense tool. Yes, but at the end of the day, people break their own rules all the time. So we need to have a guide to remind us to keep on course and to remind us that, morals are not something that are automatic. They become a choice. But attitude is also something that is kind of personal. So if we can come up with an idea for the laws, they are essentially 5 ideas for people to live by. And if they choose to live by these, I promise you, your life will be better.
Amazing.
That's how the book happened.
That book.
Yeah. Well, that's how the book happened.
I'm looking forward to reading it myself.
It's only available at alvinlaw.com, by the way.
All right, well, I'll go on Alvin Law. I read so much stuff. I apologize that I didn't get to your book. I have so many interviews. It's like one
Don't
thing
apologize.
or the other. So you've had a successful career, as we've spoken about, in radio broadcasting. Early on in your career, you'd expressed to television network executives that you would like to move into the television broadcast field. However, they were hesitant how the public would react to somebody who doesn't have arms. How did you deal with people's judgments and perceptions, and also in regards to your capabilities?
So when that story came up, that's another great question, Alexandra. This would have been in the early 1980s. Mm-hmm. We were a different society in the early 1980s. We, in fact, didn't really even have women reading the news on television in the 1980s. Mm-hmm. This is going to get real honest again, but if we did, they tended to not be all that intelligent, right? I'm being blunt. Back in the early 80s, you were a talking head. And if you were a woman on television, it was about how good you looked. We kind of changed that a little bit, didn't we? Because we had some fierce women who came along and said, pardon the honesty again, enough of the bimbos. Let's have some journalism. Exactly. That's how I changed it for me. I realized that people were not going to see the intellect of Alvin Law on television. So I gave up that fight. There was no point in pursuing it, wasting my energy. I stayed with radio because I had a great voice, but I got picked out of life from the radio career, the speaking career. That's how it transposed. I went to speak to kids as a DJ because that's what I was. I was a disc jockey. So you can imagine, if you picture me, I was like 30 pounds lighter. I had a big head, like a white boy afro, this gigantic head of hair. I wore leather clothes. I talked like this. I played rock music. I'd get up in front of junior high kids at schools and talk about being a DJ. And they would go, how do you go to the bathroom? So then I would supplant the idea of speaking about DJing or radio to another angle. And that was, I've had to learn to do this and I've had to learn to do this. Hey, boys and girls, have you had anything that's been hard for you? Hey, boys and girls, have you had anything that's been a challenge in your life? Hey, boys and girls, is there something that you feel like you'd like to dream to be, but you think it's impossible? Well, let's talk about that. All of a sudden, radio was redundant. Mm-hmm. It was a job. Then I discovered speaking was a career. And I can't lie, it was ego. No question, it was ego. But I was 21 years old. As time went by, I realized I was hiding a leadership message. And that's what I decided to do, start my own company in 1988, because I felt like I had something to say, but not for my own ego or my own bias, but to take a message to the world. And quite frankly, to balance in those days, an extremely growing negativity coming from people with disability. One of the reasons America struggles with the Americans with Disabilities Act is because it was born out of incredible hostility, anger, and it was litigious. It was written by lawyers. Everybody was mad. Life's not fair. Treat us fair. I get it. I've been angry too. I bet you have. But have you noticed anger never fixes anything?
No, anger just can make things worse.
Precisely. So when I was on my stage, controlling my act, showing my musical ability, I was able to control the message. And in doing that, I was able to provide a balance point for our society. And I continue to do that in 2021, right? I mean, I can't believe I'm still doing this, but it isn't because I have
Still young too. You're still feisty. You're still going to do so many great things in your life.
Yeah, because I'm so blessed. And I don't mean that religiously.
No,
I'm so blessed to have my life, to meet someone like you. This is the point I try to make all the time. I'm not out there, the only person on the planet without arms, being a positive person. But I'm definitely in the minority when it comes to spokespeople. Spokespeople tend to bring with them an anger. They're looking for blame. They're trying to find some reason. And to be blunt one more time, we need to change. There's no question about it. We need to change in terms of race. We need to change in terms of prejudice. But at the end of the day, you know, I said it how many times now, Alexandra? The only change can come from us. Starts with us right here.
Exactly.
Up in the head. Yeah.
Absolutely. No, I totally agree 100%. And I wish everyone could see that. So you were inducted into the Canadian Disability Hall of Fame. Congrats. That's amazing. You're welcome. What did this honor mean to you?
Well, I have to take a breath to think about what it really meant. It was funny.
Mm-hmm.
Part of me has tried in my life to not label myself disabled. But when I was approached about this award and what it was going to represent, it was so humbling. It was hard to explain. First of all, the Disability Hall of Fame in Canada would be on par with any Hall of Fame. It's not a patronizing Hall of Fame. It's full of names of people throughout years in Canada who have advanced the movement of people with disabilities to very, very important terms. Rick Hansen, the guy, Man in Motion, the man who went in a wheelchair all around the world from Canada, inspired the St. Elmo's Fire song. He's in the Hall of Fame. There's amazing people that have done incredible things, but it's not just disabled people. When I was inducted, I went in with two other individuals. One man was Jim Kite, and Jim Kite was the first and yet only deaf hockey player to play in the National Hockey League for the Toronto Maple Leafs. And he was there for 14 years. He was a really good hockey player. But my really humbling moment was I also went into the hall in 2018 with Prime Minister Brian Mulroney. So that would be like being in a Hall of Fame with a president. That's what a big a deal this was. And the luncheon was in front of 800 people at one of Canada's most prestigious hotels in Toronto called the Royal York. And it was a fancy affair. Everybody was dressed up. It was the movers and shakers of Canadian culture in that room. And to get up in front of them and be recognized for what was, in my case, in my induction, it said, for advocacy and for attitudinal change toward people with disabilities, making a considerable effort, but not only that, considerable impact to make a difference for Canadian people with disabilities. I mean, my God, I get shivers thinking about it. But what did I do? That's the question. What did I do? I never set out a goal to be in the Hall of Fame. I set out a goal to be a good person, to be a successful speaker, but more than anything, to be authentic. If we all set our goal in life to just be authentic, we'd have a lot less problems.
Absolutely. Totally. I totally agree. So lastly, if our community can take away one bit of inspiration from you today, what message do you want to give them?
We're all in this together. I know that sounds really warm and fuzzy, but the reality is I'd rather be in a warm and fuzzy environment where I'm feeling cared for, feeling loved, feeling, engaged, even though we can't hug each other. I feel the love out there. I notice it with people. In fact, to be quite honest, one more time, I noticed a significant change happening in our culture back in the spring because we were forced to be locked down. And then George Floyd was murdered. And there's no excuse for that. They nailed it, boy. That cop deserves to go away for life. That's not a cop. That's just an angry, hostile human being. Okay. But what happened, unfortunately, it stopped the momentum of positive growth for caring for each other and brought up this bug, this this thing we sit on that is full of nails and pins and needles that we just can't get comfortable because it's a very uncomfortable topic, yet we need to talk about it. So maybe now that we've had a chance to reflect as we go into 2021, as corny as this sounds, just respect each other. But more than anything, understand we really do have a lot to be grateful for at the end of the day. And by the way, we never finished the answer to the question. What do I play?
You play the drums?
Yeah.
And then you also play the piano?
Yeah.
And then, sorry, there's a lot.
No, the first instrument I played was the trombone. I played the trombone.
Oh, wait, that was your first instrument. Okay.
Yeah. I had a band director mounted on the side of a chair that I played with my foot like this. Why am I telling you this? Because who does that? Who gives a guy or a gal without arms an opportunity to play in band using their foot on a trombone? The perfect example of the kind of person we should all aspire to be. Mr. McClary was his name. He was one of the best human beings I've ever met in my life. Last question. This is a rhetorical question for you, Alexander, as we finish this interview. Ask yourself a question as we go into 2021. What kind of difference do you want to make going into this year? And what can you do to change your own little part of the world? Because to think that we can't is simply wrong. We can do anything. We can do anything.
I agree. You know what? That's that question. I mean, I should post it on my Facebook. That is like the epitome. Because what difference can we make?
Well, we can. And I think that's what's wrong with so many of our decisions is we think that we get our feeling for being human by external sources. When the reality is, what I've learned in my lifetime is the more you give, the more you get. And you live in a beautiful city to be able to do that, right?
Yeah, I give a lot. I give a lot. Probably maybe sometimes too much because that's just who I am. And I think
that's right. But here's the key. You cannot expect to get something back in return for your investment of giving. It has to be from the heart. It has to be from the soul, and it has to be genuine. And I know this all sounds really nice, but the reality is most people, they don't understand that we get things in life not by stealing them, but by giving so much that they just drop in our lap. That's how we get the love of our lives, the joys of our lives, and the love for being human. And by the way, New York's a perfect example. On the outside, it looks crusty, but on the inside, it is some of the most amazing people on planet Earth live in New York.
Yeah. So how often do you come to, I mean, obviously this is pre-COVID, but how often do you make a trip to the U.S.?
I would usually average at least a half a dozen times a year in New York because I tended to, before things closed down, I was very commonly going to big events that needed big venues. So Las Vegas, Los Angeles, not to drop names, right? But New York, there's something about it. I think it's because there's so much entertainment there. And there's a great example, right? If I want to be really blunt one more time before we finish, positive attitude cannot take away from the horrible nature of what happened to Broadway, what happened to all the theaters, what happened to all the restaurants, what happened to all of the going out. That is a harsh reality. So I want to make it very clear that just because I'm being a positive individual doesn't mean that I'm not hurting either, right? I had 85% of my gigs go down. And that's hard when you're depending on performing for your paycheck. But the fact of the matter is, I'm still alive. I'm not hungry. I got a roof over my head. And by the way, at the end of the day, I get to meet people like you who are out there changing the balance. Just like Malcolm Gladwell talked about, change that tipping point because we've all got a reason to be.
Absolutely. Amen to that.